Now that my oldest son is taller than me, it was tempting to preach on the story of David and Goliath. I feel more than the usual amount of affinity with David at the moment. But instead, what I'm going to speak about today is an enemy far more fearsome than the giant. A giant, of course, is a symbol of an enemy who is like us in some respects, just much bigger, much stronger. Giants are imposing and terrifying, but as the Old Testament tale reveals, they can be defeated in the right circumstances and with the Lord's help. After all, as we all know, David kills Goliath. But there is something else that confronts us with how small and powerless we are, even more than a giant can. Something that is not like us, just bigger, as you'd say of a giant, but something that is unlike us and also much bigger. When he was a child, the English poet William Wordsworth absconded one night, went down to a nearby lake and borrowed a rowboat that he found. And he paddled out into the middle of the lake just to enjoy himself by himself in the darkness under the starry sky. As he paddled along, he came nearer to an enormous cliff that seemed to rise up above him. To him, in the darkness that night, it seemed as if this cliff was alive. It looked as if it was standing, glaring down upon him, and even starting to move towards him. And that night on the lake, alone, afraid, seeing cliffs towering over him, inching towards him in terror, he paddled madly back to shore and ran home, haunted for days afterwards by this image of nature that seemed enormous and vast and just a little bit angry. Nature confronts us with our smallness. And nature has some specific weapons that often it uses. Sometimes the weapon is simply the weapon of size, enormity, vastness that makes us feel overwhelmed. But of course there are other things as well, more dramatic. There are things like fires and floods that show us how vulnerable we are. And of course, some of nature's smallest weapons, viruses, can also help us to see how weak and vulnerable we are, wouldn't you agree? But there is one weapon, though, of particular ferocity and power that shows us to be weak and helpless in comparison, and that weapon is the storm. Storms, as you know, if you've been caught in an enormous thunderstorm, you will know how terrifying, how violent they are, what havoc and noise and destruction is brought by a storm. One thing about a storm is it's always far greater than the power of any single person to deal with it. David, even on his best day, could not have dealt with a storm, even if he could kill a giant. If I were to ask you what the problem is with our world, if you're a Christian, your likely reply would be the great problem with the world is the problem of sin, our rebellion against God. And I would not disagree with that. But it's not that sin is the only problem or the only manifestation of the problem at work in our world. Another major problem is the problem of storms. By storms, I don't just mean weather events. A storm can stand for anything that is chaotic and wild and destructive. And in Scripture, its particular symbol or image is the sea, the unruly sea. Whereas sin exists and arises from within the human heart, storms exist in the world around us as well. Whereas sin attacks goodness, storms attack order and beauty. In the book of Job, a storm has all but destroyed Job's life. The storm in question here is partly a weather event, but only partly. Job has been, as you know the story, ferociously assaulted from all sides at once. He has lost his family, he's lost his wealth, he's lost his health, and he's lost his good name. He's also lost his sense of the way the world works, his sense of who God is. Whatever theology he had has been blown to pieces and torn to shreds, and he's now sitting in the rubble in complete despair and lostness. And of course, in our gospel reading as well, there is another storm, a more literal storm this time, with the disciples being tossed about on the sea at the mercy of forces far too strong for them and in abject terror. In our lives, storms can come in many shapes and sizes. A storm may come in the form of a series of catastrophes in your life, of different kinds. It might come in the form of a frenzy of demands that you just can't keep up with. It might come in the form of a painful attack from somebody that you once trusted. And in addition to that, there are some people who are just living, breathing storms. They are so consumed by disorder that everywhere they go, storms and chaos just jump off them like a contagion onto all who are around them. Most of us have people like this in our lives. They are not our enemy. They are not usually malicious, but they can be an amazing vehicle of chaos, mayhem, and confusion. And just when you feel like you're getting things sorted out and you're re-establishing some sort of equilibrium, they call or send you an email and somehow involve you in the mad whirlwind of their life. Storms, in whichever form they come at us, they disorient and they destroy and they tear apart, which is the exact opposite of what God does. The God of the Christian scriptures is a God whose spirit brings order and healing and beauty. God leads people to a place of sanity and peace. Where there is violence, he restores harmony. I want you to think of the creation story at the very beginning of the Bible. In the story of creation, this is essentially a story of order coming from chaos. Jack, can you just click to the next slide, mate? My clicker's not working. Thanks. The symbol of chaos is the unruly sea, which is there at the very beginning of the Bible, a wild, stormy entity that lacks order and restraint. But God's Spirit imposes order on this unruly mess, as God's Spirit always does when he encounters restlessness and disturbance. God takes the chaotic flux of the dark waters, and as he speaks, what he does is he makes some distinctions and divisions which allow for beauty and order to emerge. So, for instance, the Lord divides the chaotic waters into the waters above and the waters below. And then he divides the waters from the dry land. The stormy sea is not destroyed, but it's placed within proper bounds. It's in God's nature to make appropriate separations and distinctions so that the disorder of chaos and endless fluidity can turn instead to ordered relationship. Whereas it's in the nature of storms to break down distinctions and thus to damage real relationship. So when God's preserving hand is withdrawn from the creation, ordered distinctions disappear as well, which is precisely the story of the flood. The violence of the human heart finds its counterpart in the violence of the seas in the story of the flood. And when the seas become violent, they no longer respect the proper boundaries God has assigned to them. They try to extend their chaos beyond its proper limits. They reject the important distinction between sea and dry land. And so one possible help when you are in one of life's storms might be simply to imitate the work of God by restoring some boundaries and some order. God turns chaos into order through separations and distinctions. Again, in the story of Genesis, he distinguishes day from night, light from darkness, plant and animal life from the ground, the earth, woman from man. And to abolish these proper distinctions, to project fluidity on everything, is to move things further from beauty and order and towards a kind of stormy chaos and uncreation. It's ultimately to deny the possibility of proper relationship. So, for instance, it might be helpful when life is stormy to recognise some boundaries. For example, it might be helpful to recognise boundaries between people. That I am not you, and that you are not me. Your role is not mine, and mine is not yours. Another person's problems don't necessarily and automatically become your problems simply because you learn that they exist. You may choose to take on another person's burden. As a Christian, I hope that we will all do that habitually. But hopefully we'll do that while preserving important and proper distinctions between ourselves without blurring identities. Blurring is what storms do. And in a relationship, that can manifest in all sorts of unhelpful dependencies when we're not clear about who is who. There are other distinctions that are sometimes important to reassert. For instance, the distinction between work and rest. How many problems creep in when that important boundary is breached? Other distinctions like appropriate and not appropriate. Even something simple like separating the mess on your bedroom floor into a pile called clothes and non-clothes might be a start. Now maybe you're in the middle of a period of chaos in your life right now, and if you're not, it's likely that at some point soon you will be, because we cannot avoid it. There might be for you at the moment a time of chaos that has caught you up in its whirlwind, and you are on the brink of feeling overwhelmed. And it might even be that this is one of those storms where simply reasserting some boundaries is of no real help. Remember, storms are bigger than we are, their destructive force is enormous, and they easily override our resistance. One common mistake when caught in the middle of a storm is to misunderstand where God is in relation to the storm. To think, for instance, that God is the one who created and sent the storm to you. Or even worse, to confuse the storm with God. Now that's not an entirely crazy mistake to make. Storms do confront us with our powerlessness. They are unfathomable and they are unknowable, and in a sense, they are God-like. Job is certainly humbled before the storm, but God is not the storm. A stormy whirlwind has been spinning Job's life around, and certainly that whirlwind has revealed some of God's truth, and yet God is not the whirlwind. The destructive fury that has been unleashed on poor Job is, the story tells us, of satanic origin, not divine origin. On the contrary, God is the one who, as we see in this text, places limits on the waters. He's placed limits around the damage that can be done to Job. Thus far you shall come, he says, and no farther. The incredible point is that while God is not the storm, while the storm is in fact satanic, even so, in the midst of this storm, the Lord is present. For all of its power, one thing that the storm cannot do is create a space in which God is not present. And so from within the whirlwind, it seems, the Lord speaks, and he speaks words to Job that will restore and restabilise his damaged and angry spirit. God is not the storm, but God is in the storm, which is something we also see in our reading in Mark's Gospel. Same truth, presented in another way. The disciples are caught in the storm on Lake Galilee as the water is whipped up around them in a sort of demonic frenzy. And in the storm with them, unrecognised by them, is their God. They fail to recognise him, not like Job because the whirlwind has hidden God, but because of their inability to see more deeply into the identity of this man in the boat beside them. The failure to recognise the identity of Jesus is also what makes us feel that we are alone and helpless and even doomed when the waves of life start to beat against our ship. The man who is in the boat with them turns out to be, as the story makes clear, every bit as terrifying as the God who speaks to Job. The disciples were afraid of the storm, but they are in awe, we are told, of the one whose power turns out to be greater than the storm. The one who, like Job's God, is greater than the storm and yet present in the storm with them. And in the midst of that storm reenacts the creation, which brings order and beauty from chaos. The temptation for us is to believe that we can defeat the storm. And the temptation for the preacher is to offer people the hope that they can find a way to stop the storm, maybe by praying more or trusting Jesus more. But the point of the storm, as I said before, is that we cannot defeat it. A storm is not a Goliath who could potentially be felled with a well-aimed shot. Of course, there are some storms that we can choose not to sail into. There are occasions when we open ourselves to very avoidable chaos. But there is no way to avoid chaos and storms altogether. Destructive forces will find us out, no matter how we try to order our lives. We need to hang on and we need to wait until the storm blows itself out, because storms are not usually long-lived. They're very violent, but they don't last forever. But not just to hang on. We're also, I think, invited by our gospel reading today to recognise who is in the storm beside us, often unrecognised by us. It makes a difference, I think, to the storm that you're in. It doesn't resolve the storm, doesn't take away the waves instantly, but it does make a difference to recognise that there is one who is beside you who is not afraid, one whom the sea has no choice ultimately but to obey, one who may let the wind blow pretty hard for a while, and maybe in a way that will stretch our faith and sometimes even bring us to the edge of panic, but who will eventually order the sea's tantrum to stop, and it must obey. Sometimes we will, like the disciples, cry out to him saying, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" But of course we know that he cares. In Jesus Christ, God has entered the stormy chaos. He's even entered the ultimate uncreation of death. He's overcome it not from without, but from within the storm. He is, after all, the one whose voice created order from chaos in the beginning. It's his voice who was responsible for Noah's salvation through the flood, who led his people through the divided Red Sea to a place of safety, who was there to save Jonah from the depths, and who saved his disciples with a word, leaving them to ask in amazement, "Who is this man that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And he will continue to save his people from every expression of destructive, watery chaos, allowing us to say in the words of Psalm 46, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains should shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam. God is in the midst of the city and shall not be moved. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge."